A critical week for South Korea and its alliance with the U.S. and relations with Japan this week. A series of high-level South Korea-U.S. defense and security talks are starting to wrap up, with a third round of defense cost-sharing talks concluding today and the looming termination of a military intel sharing pact with Japan set for later this week. A key moment for Seoul, Washington, Tokyo ties. Let's take one step further. Now, joining me live from Washington and via Skype is Scott Snyder, senior researcher at the Council on Foreign Relations. Scott, great to see you this morning.
Yeah, good to be with you, Jen.
Now, Scott, key U.S. military officials have been visiting Seoul back-to-back for the last week, including the Defense Secretary, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman, and the top U.S. negotiator in defense cost-sharing talks. He's currently in Seoul right now. What kind of a message, in your view, are they carrying to the Seoul government?
Well, of course, a lot of this activity is about the alliance, about the security consultation meetings, but I think that the issues that are getting the greatest focus are the cost-sharing talks, as you mentioned, ongoing, and also the apparent South Korean decision to withdraw from the intelligence sharing agreement between South Korea and Japan.
Right. So first, let's talk about South Korea's decision not to renew the military intel sharing pact with Japan. Now, despite Mark Esper's meeting with his South Korean counterpart and his meeting with South Korean president, Washington has failed to, convince Seoul to renege on its decision. What is the U.S. stance on this? And more importantly, what are the ramifications of Seoul's decision to terminate this pact?
Well, I think the United States has publicly, repeatedly expressed its view that South Korea should remain in the intelligence sharing agreement. I think the reason for that is that the United States is opposed to steps by either the government of South Korea or the government of Japan that would undermine the indivisibility of security between South Korea and Japan. And I think that the GSOMIA pact has become seen as a symbolic representation of the fact that the U.S. views South Korea's and Japan's security as indivisible from each other.
And on to the Defense Cost-Sharing Pact. Officials from Seoul and Washington wrap up their third round of talks today. They've been trying to narrow a $4 billion gap in how much the U.S. wants South Korea to pay for the cost of hosting U.S. troops here. Reports of Trump's $5 billion demand earlier this month were greeted with shock in Seoul. What's the U.S. argument in these negotiations, and how do you think Seoul should go about negotiating the terms?
So my understanding is that the U.S. negotiators are bringing with them a new formula for calculating cost sharing. It involves elements that have not been a part of prior cost-sharing negotiations, including asking South Korea to bear costs for troops, operations, and equipment that may not be located on the peninsula. I'm sure that South Korea also probably, if the formula is going to be revised, South Korea may also have its own items that it would like to include as part of that calculation. And you're absolutely correct that the gap is very large. And I think that actually we haven't seen the public rationale for the $5 billion or $4.7 billion price tag. And so it's hard to evaluate at this time. But I think that it's also hard without knowing how those items are being valued to justify that level of request.
Now, last but not least, Scott, is there a possibility that the U.S. will use South Korea's termination of GSOMIA to their advantage in negotiating a better deal for them in the defense cost-sharing talks?
I do not see a way that the GSOMIA decision can be used to the U.S. advantage, but I do believe that it is possible that the decision could result in a hardening of the U.S. position and make it more difficult to resolve the cost-sharing issue.
All right. Scott Snyder, senior researcher at Washington-based Council on Foreign Relations, our always go-to expert on South Korea-U.S. relations. Many thanks, as always, for your insights this morning.
Thank you so much.